Jeremy Siegel, arquitecto de la firma Big, excepcional en el mundo de la arquitectura, urbanismo, paisaje, infraestructura y adaptación al cambio climático. Ha dirigido grandes y exitosos proyectos a lo largo de su carrera, como el Penang South Island, y también ha enseñado en la Universidad de Cornell, Universidad de Pensilvania y Escuela de Ambientes Construidos Parsons. Así que le damos la bienvenida a Jeremy Siegel.
Gracias, buenas tardes a todos y gracias por la invitación. My name is Jeremy Siegel. I'm with Big out of New York City, and it's really my pleasure to be here. There's nothing I love more than experiencing and learning about new cities. So it's really wonderful to be here in Guatemala City. I had some time this afternoon also to spend some time with the team from the Alcaldía to learn a bit about some of the thinking and initiatives that are going on here, which are quite exciting. And I'm very happy to present today on urban mobility, which is a kind of theme that's very near and dear to my heart and to Big's heart. And you know, the more I look at cities, the more I go to cities that work and cities that don't. It really is clear that mobility is both a key driver of success and also a key indicator of success or lack thereof. Reducing the amount of time that we spend in cars is good for economies, it's good for the environment, and it's good for people. So I am pleased this evening to share with you a series of projects which address urban mobility either as a focus or as sort of part of their agendas. And to also talk about this idea of social infrastructure, which is a way in which we approach many of our projects around the world. First, a little bit about Big, for those of you who may not be familiar. We are in New York, where I'm based, originally from Copenhagen. We're also in a few other cities. Copenhagen is also where our founder, my colleague Bjarke, is from, seen here flying in front of the West 57 building in New York, which was the first thing that led to our office there, about when I joined. We have a dedicated and passionate workforce, and we like to experiment. We really like to push the boundaries with every project and try to explore what hasn't been done yet. Recently, we've become a bit more of a multidisciplinary office, what we call the Big Leap. So we are architecture and architects, but we're also landscape designers, engineers, urban planners, and even product designers. And we work at a whole range of scales. So everything from light bulbs and sofas to parks and buildings to city and regional plans. Just a little bit of an introduction to Big to give you a sense of where we come from and what the kind of experience is that has informed our more recent projects. The Harbor Bath was one of our first projects in Copenhagen, a project that was built on the occasion of the harbor becoming so clean that you could swim in it. So this has become a major kind of attraction in the center of Copenhagen. Early housing projects like the VM House and the Mountain next door, kind of testing the boundaries of individuality and customization within a building, and also sort of using standard components, but trying to generate diversity and community in a building with them, in kind of a surprising way. The 8 House, another early project, where we're also really looking at how to create a community in a high-density mixed-use development. And in this case, we sort of wrapped the street and the countryside up into the building itself, creating kind of a three-dimensional village where many apartments have their own front door, and where there is kind of a sense of community and neighborhood that is very unique and hard to find in those kinds of settings. Some other experiments with housing, the Urban Rigger, where we're looking at kind of modular prefabrication to produce sort of affordable housing. This is student housing that's being built in Copenhagen on the harbor. Also really looking at creating community within the building with a central courtyard. There's a series of 3 one-bedrooms at the ground floor of each of these and 9 studios up top. The studios are about 30 square meters apiece and the one-bedrooms are about 90. or actually about 60. Again, kind of for a quite modest effort, creating a lot of quality and a lot of value. Also looking at mass production, these are being built in Poland and then tugged into place in Copenhagen. Another kind of modular approach where rather than sort of layering the modules in complete layers, we stagger them and create these gaps between them. And the gaps become living spaces that actually have a much higher floor-to-floor height than is normal. So this kind of extra feeling of generousness in middle and low-income housing. Another sort of experiment, a place too, in Denmark, looking at prefabricated modular cores and slabs with unitized balconies and units that are attached to those cores that then create some pretty interesting architectural effects and feeling of community within. Superkillen, one of our kind of earlier planning and public space projects where we're working in a neighborhood that's actually the most diverse neighborhood in Copenhagen, with over 100 nationalities represented. So in this case, rather than just design the whole park ourselves, we sort of crowdsourced the design out to the community. And we created a platform whereby community members could sort of suggest pieces of urban furniture from the places that they were originally from. So they were all kind of entered online, and eventually the winners were ordered and placed in the park. So we have fountains from Morocco, a sound system from Jamaica, a boxing ring from Thailand, a bus stop from Kazakhstan, this plaything from Japan, benches from Mexico, and so on. So sort of community engagement extreme, you could say. And then finally, with the Amager Resource Center in Copenhagen, we won the competition to beautify a waste-to-energy plant, which processes all of Copenhagen's waste and turns it into energy with a byproduct of some steam and CO2. But rather than sort of just create a pretty facade, we remarked that this structure would be the tallest structure in Copenhagen, a place that has a lot of snow, but no mountains. So we proposed a ski slope on top of it and won. And this was just completed a few years ago. And it is now a sort of much-loved landmark in Copenhagen, also with the world's tallest climbing wall, a multi-pitch rock wall of a few hundred meters. We've also started more and more doing work in this part of the world, in Central and South America. A few of our first projects, this is a sort of residential quarter and a recording studio where I think Drake recorded his latest album or parts of it in the Bahamas. This is a residence in Mexico. A few sort of high-rise residential projects in Quito, Ecuador, that we're quite excited about. This one, Icon, is the first one that's going to be built. It's a series of balconies that each have a tree and a space for planting, and you can see the modules of the facade kind of adapt to accommodate the soil depth for those trees. This is also nearing completion. We're really excited about this one. And so our approach to infrastructure and planning is I think, embedded, or you can find the roots of it in our approach to buildings, which is, I think, what we're always trying to do is sort of add additional agendas to the agenda of a given brief or a given project, and try to create projects and investments that accomplish multiple goals, and that really think comprehensively across the systems of the city. One of the first sort of large-scale examples of this is a project that I've been working on for the last almost decade. I think it's been like 8 years. The Big U in New York City, where after Hurricane Sandy, a federal competition asked us to rethink our cities in light of storm surge and the increasing threats that cities on the eastern seaboard are facing. So we focused on Lower Manhattan, this area that was dubbed South of Power just after the event. If you look at that area, you'll see that the original coastline was actually about 50% further inland. So there's been a program of land reclamation over the last 400 years or so, started with the Dutch, continued by the British, even continued a bit into the 20th century, where the landmass of the island has increased and economic activity has been able to sort of concentrate around the harbor as a result, which has been great. But the downside is that all of that land has been built at a quite low elevation. So as we have more and more storms coming into New York Harbor, we're basically going to need to do something about it. Basically, north of 57th and 42nd Streets, the topography is very high, so it's not an issue. So basically, the need in Lower Manhattan is to build some form of an elevated edge to protect against future storm surges. And our approach was to say that if it's approached in sort of a functional engineering way, that we would create another kind of urban disaster, which would be the cutting off of the city from the waterfront. So we kind of looked to the High Line, which is a piece of, one might say, social infrastructure, a train viaduct that was, after the fact, programmed as a park, and in quite a narrow footprint creates a great amenity for Chelsea. And so we were wondering how we could do this ourselves with the resiliency infrastructure in New York City, how we could work with the sort of scale and also the diversity and variety of the communities that sit along this coastline, and how we can also work with the sort of floodplain. The notion of doing 10 miles of continuous protection all in one go is a daunting one, difficult financially, difficult politically. So we realized quite early on that by kind of breaking up the system of the big U into a series of little U's, we could sort of start smaller and sort of work our way around the island. And each of these compartments, as we call them, could be financed, administrated, designed, at the appropriate time with the appropriate stakeholders. And in that way, doing two things. One, sort of creating redundancy. So if one compartment were to fail, at some point the system would still work overall. But also creating variety along this length, which is a real kind of series of very diverse neighborhoods. So for those of you who are familiar with urban planning in New York City, we thought of this as kind of a scenario where Robert Moses, the sort of central planner of New York in the 20th century, and Jane Jacobs, his sort of neighborhood activist nemesis, who killed many of his projects, were to collaborate together on a project. So to do that, for the Jane Jacobs kind of part of it, we had to understand who was living along this coastline, what all the relevant stakeholders were, both on the nonprofit and community side, but also government, federal, state, and local, as well as the private sector, businesses. And through a series of briefings, meetings, workshops, we sort of met with everyone. We slowly started to zero in on the Lower East Side as a place to start. It's a place with a lot of social vulnerability, 130,000 residents, 86,000 of whom are low-income, elderly, or disabled, living in about 30,000 public housing units. And so working with local community groups, we began to sort of craft a plan. And I think one big innovation for us there, because we were sort of an independent entity, is we were able to approach the community with kind of an openness and a transparency that perhaps is not so normal in New York City planning, where a lot of things are kept sort of closer to the chest. So we sort of made, architectural models of all the various options for flood protection, from narrow footprint flood walls to programmed parks and even sort of buried highways and more sort of involved efforts. And over a series of workshops, we sort of zeroed in on solutions for each part of the waterfront. And we found these to be a really great way of engaging with people. And so after that whole effort, our project was awarded first place of $335 million to implement phase one. It's pretty rare that you get the governor, the senior senator, the mayor, all on one stage. So it was a great moment. And then we proceeded with the first phase, East Side Coastal Resiliency, which will be 70 acres and about $1.5 billion. About 8 years of construction, a sense of scale with respect to Central Park and the High Line. And here's I think where mobility comes in, urban mobility. So Lower East Side used to be a working waterfront where there were a series of piers and the sort of very dense tenements. This was one of the densest places in the entire country and maybe in the world at the time. And in the 1930s, an at-grade boulevard was created, and a park was created outboard by Robert Moses, actually. In the 1950s, as car culture became the norm, the at-grade boulevard, which you could cross easily, was turned into an expressway. And today, that expressway cuts the neighborhood off from the waterfront with only 5 points of access across about 2 miles. The bridges are the same ones that were originally built, so substandard crossings. And the Manhattan Greenway here can use some work. This is one of the sort of major north-south arteries. And then also a series of kind of passive and active recreational spaces sit along this area that we also need to sort of elevate, protect, and enhance, as well as the planting, which is increasingly affected by climate change. So again, working with the community, we devised a plan for the park. This is the Hurricane Sandy floodplain, the 100-year floodplain. You can get a sense of scale there for how deep it goes in. So the flood protection runs along this length. Then the park is elevated to meet that elevation. A series of key programs are preserved and lifted up and rebuilt in place. And then a series of passive recreation areas are placed between those. New bridges, and this is a really key feature, new pedestrian bridges will bridge across the FDR Drive into the neighborhood. And so a seamless circulation system is created. The Manhattan Greenway is enhanced and gives access to a number of programmed areas, which we worked with the community to identify what made sense where. So this gives you a sense of what will be built. This is a bridge at Delancey Street, framing into the park. 3 new bridges over the FDR, and a series of amenities along the length. So this gives you a little bit of a 3-dimensional sense of the project. You can see the flood wall there towards the back, the Greenway, one of the first bridges. And yeah, sort of changing along its length and accommodating various activities. This is under construction. This is the first piece of the flood wall, built in situ in cast concrete. You can see a guy there for scale. So this is striated at every foot. And we worked really hard to find an approach where we could have a concrete wall that was sort of inspectable by the relevant authorities, but that had a sense of scale and playfulness to it. And then you can see here Mayor de Blasio sort of outlining the next steps in this sort of phased approach of compartments along the length. So a lot of the lessons from that project around community engagement and engagement with the government, we sort of took into some other projects for New York City. This is BQ Park in Brooklyn, where another Robert Moses project, the BQE Triple Cantilever, was built in the 1950s. Kind of an amazing feat of engineering that has a wonderful park on top of it. You can see the promenade up there. But the lower portions of it are corroding. The steel reinforcement is corroding. And it's very dire. Like by the 2030s, the whole thing could collapse, if not sooner. The problem is that there's a much-loved park on top of it. This is one of my neighborhood parks, the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. And the city of New York, their original kind of proposal for this area was to build a 6-lane highway, a temporary 6-lane highway through this park, and to sort of work only within their own right-of-way, their own jurisdiction to do this. For them, that was a benefit. And sort of repair the underside and then put the park back on top eventually. The community sort of reacted like this, and this is our current mayor, Eric Adams, who was the Brooklyn Borough president at the time. So this group, A Better Way, came to us because we're a neighborhood office, and then a lot of us live in the neighborhood just adjacent, and asked us if we could look at other solutions for this area. So we kind of looked at the historic urban fabric of Brooklyn and the original condition where there was a more seamless kind of interlacing of city and river. And we also took a look at the real physical conditions that we have on site. Looking at it, I would say, more as designers than as planners, in the sense that we tend not to see jurisdictional boundaries so much. So what we realized was that the back of the park with this sort of berm and the parking there is really there as a buffer for all of the noise and sort of visual pollution of the highway. And that if the city, which owned everything up until the sidewalk, could coordinate with the state, which controlled the park, a joint solution could be made where the highway would actually be built at ground level using a piece of the park. But eventually, after construction, and you could also construct the highway while the existing highway was operating, after construction, additional park could be placed on top, and you would get a sort of net gain of about 12 acres of parkland. There was a lot of kind of engineering and a lot of traffic planning that had to go into this. So understanding how the phasing would work, how various lanes would be shut down, switched over, and eventually capped over. This was actually a pro bono effort, so we worked with a team of engineers from New York that were also passionate about this. And we also worked with the landscape designers of Brooklyn Bridge Park to imagine what the park would be like with the highway covered and capped. So, a much smoother connection up to the neighborhood, a much smoother connection down to the park from the neighborhood, additional space for programming, and in some places, really radical changes. So in this case, at this point, the highway would actually be below ground. So you would have just, a complete transformation of this access way to the park. It wasn't enough just to sort of put the big idea out there. In order to prove out the idea, we had to address each and every one of these issues, which were brought up by all the various sort of naysayers about the project. We met with the MTA and figured out how to deal with the kind of nitty-gritty of the substations, meeting with their chief electrical engineers. We figured out a way to sort of build a temporary, or basically build a new electrical substation above the existing one, and then switch one offline while the other is turning on, and integrate it into the park. Also looking at sort of complex engineering conditions in these areas. So this is all to say that, the big idea is great, but we also take a lot of time to go in depth and understand the technical parameters of the solutions that we're proposing. And of course, engagement, again, sort of building off of the experience from the Big U, is something that we continued here to make sure we're getting buy-in. So we sort of got a number of audiences with the mayor's expert panel that was formed to look at this problem, and presented at this kind of epic town hall of about 1,200 people in Brooklyn Heights. After about a year of work, City Council endorsed our proposal as the most feasible and also cheapest solution. So we're now waiting basically for the new mayor, Eric Adams, to sort of decide what to do, but we're hopeful that, that the advice will be taken. And we worked with a local animator to produce this this vision of what the project would be like, and also what the soundscape would be like. So I'll shut up for a second. So the highway's below this parkland, and the old highway, this double shelf that you can see here, is transformed into a park. So from the BQ Expressway to BQ Park. And so we've just been on the Brooklyn waterfront and we've been on the Manhattan waterfront. And the thing that connects them is the Brooklyn Bridge, which is a piece of infrastructure we also had the opportunity to look at with New York City Council last summer. This was a really exciting competition where we were asked to think about this historic bridge. This is a Thomas Edison video, one of just an early example of film taken on the streetcar. Actually, this is the heavy rail. So this is sort of a predecessor to the subway that he's on. You can see streetcars to the right. And the impetus for this competition was that the promenade in the middle of the bridge is chronically overcrowded, or at least it was before COVID. The competition then actually ended up happening during COVID, so it was kind of a funny, a funny duality between an empty bridge and a full bridge. But what COVID and also a lot of the kind of demonstrations that were happening around the same time, around Black Lives Matter and sort of related social issues. Repeatedly, I was kind of in demonstrations like this, which took over streets and somehow said, "This street is ours now. It's for people." And there were even bike protests that were happening all around the city, where just giant groups of bikers would wind their way through streets and across bridges. So you can see here thousands of people walking along the roadway here. And it really became a moment to rethink what the bridge could be. As I said, originally, there were actually only one lane per direction of the equivalent of a private vehicle, which was the horse carriage, and the horse carriages had to pay a toll. In addition to that, there were streetcars. You can see how many of them there are that sort of fan their way out into the entire city. And then there's heavy rail in the center, which is basically the predecessor to the subway. And at its peak in the 1930s, when the city's population was 1 or 2 million, this bridge carried 425,000 people a day. Robert Moses, again, a recurring theme in all of his wisdom, demolished the streetcar terminals just after World War II to make way for cars. We now have 3 lanes of cars in either direction. And the city, which is now at about 8 million, even though we've had a quadrupling of the city's population, we've had a more than halving of the capacity of the bridge. So the bridge is really good at moving cars. It's very bad at moving people. And it's bad at moving people on the promenade as well. So for us, we decided to take a bold step and say, what if we removed all cars from this bridge? If so, where could that traffic go? The Brooklyn Bridge connects downtown Manhattan to downtown Brooklyn, so it is a good candidate for a sort of carless connection. And working with Arup, we were able to identify how the traffic could disperse, and also how congestion pricing, which will start to basically create tolls to pass through Manhattan, would also reduce demand. We also were very cognizant of the fact that in Denmark, where Big is from, 40 or 50 years ago, the share of cyclists commuting was in the low single digits. Today, the number of cyclists who commute is the number of commuters who are on bikes is 62% of all commuters. And that's not just a cultural thing that happened through policy and through design. There has been a very concerted effort over the last 4 or 5 decades to remove on-street parking, to introduce safe, dedicated bike lanes, and that has led to the great biking city that Denmark is today. So New York has a lot of ways to go, 1% today. So even if we could get to just 10%, 1/6 of Denmark, there's a whole lot more traffic that would be on the roads in terms of bikes. We knew, though, that we couldn't do this all in one shot, so we looked at a kind of phased approach where initially only a single lane of traffic in either direction would be converted into a bike lane. Over time, on the northern edge, the traffic would be converted to bus only, and a bus service would be run between downtown Brooklyn and downtown Manhattan. Eventually, the southern portion of the bridge would be converted into a pedestrian-only plaza, a sort of linear plaza through the sky. And the sort of transit corridor could accommodate, other forms of mobility, autonomous transit, small electric shuttles, et cetera. So on the northern side, the kind of transit corridor, very simple intervention, just a median to separate bikes from transit, and then allowing transit to run. And then on the southern side, with the really epic views out to New York Harbor, in the near term, it could be just simple weekend closures or more permanent closure with sidewalk painting and food trucks and movable furniture. And then in the long term, as people became comfortable with the idea and as traffic sort of found its way elsewhere, converting this entire length into a pedestrian plaza. With all kinds of opportunities over the course of a day or over the course of the year for different kinds of activities. Another sort of major impact of doing this would be the impact at the bridge abutments. This is where highway viaducts are connecting the FDR, which we saw in the ESCR project, to the Brooklyn Bridge. And so if the Brooklyn Bridge does not have cars on it, none of those viaducts would be necessary. And so in addition to the space on the bridge, a whole series of areas totaling about 35 acres would be made available for parks and open spaces, including the areas underneath the bridge, which could then help sort of stitch together these two communities that have been really cut off from one another. You can see the barrier that it creates today. And the potential here, including space for urban shade, which we really need as climate change makes our cities hotter, water, commerce, etc. So the idea was kind of tested on the bridge, but it's an idea that we thought should go much further into New York. So connecting to Broadway, which has already started to be pedestrianized, and bike lanes have started to be placed there by the Bloomberg administration, and then to other major corridors in Brooklyn, first connecting out radially to all of the neighborhoods to allow people to get back and forth to the core of jobs, but then eventually creating a more even grid that allows north-south connections in the outer boroughs, Brooklyn and Queens, which is something that the city is sorely lacking today, because most of our subway lines follow sort of a similar pattern to this, a radial one. So often to get from, the laser pointer doesn't work, but to get from, let's say, the southern part of Brooklyn to the northern part of Brooklyn, you actually have to go into Manhattan and then back out. So these sort of even grids are something that, as we've been designing new cities, we always look to incorporate. And I'll get to that with another project or two. And of course, that is going to be happening on existing corridors, so that also has to be phased over time. And in places with not a lot of shade, which this is the existing condition today on Flatbush Avenue, shade is a really important component combined with bike paths to keep them comfortable in the heat of the summer, and again, as climate change makes cities hotter, and then eventually sort of turning over other lanes to other kinds of vehicles. And there's a whole host of benefits that come with this, from better mental health through better walkability, reduction of pollution in the air with trees, better handling of stormwater, and even better activation of commerce through more biking and walking. And so, with this one, we're very pleased that in the last few months, the city took the advice of the project and created the first lane closure here on the northern side. So this is the first way. It's a 2-lane one right now, but we're hopeful that the equivalent on the other side will also soon be put into place. So that's working within an existing context. I'm going to move on now to a few projects where we've been working in sort of a new context and been able to think about the ideas that we've developed in existing cities and sort of work with more of a blank slate. This is work we've been doing for Toyota. They're on their kind of campus at the base of Mount Fuji in Japan. They wanted to create a city that would be opened within this decade that would become a living laboratory for a whole series of technologies that they're working on in-house. And so mobility was obviously a key driver here. And our first observation was that people, bikes, e-bikes, scooters, and vehicles travel all at different speeds. And yet we tend to cluster them in the same street condition where conflicts basically occur. So the idea here with the woven city, which Toyota actually ended up copywriting, they liked this name so much, is to sort of separate these kinds of streets and create a series of different streets that weave together, almost like a plaid pattern, to create a different kind of city where faster access is in blue on the exterior, sort of medium speed access happens in the pink, and then slower speed walking and biking happens in the yellow. And this can sort of multiply, it can distort to accommodate different kinds of open spaces, and it formed the basis for our master plan for the area. This gives you a little view of how that concept might work, if it'll come up. Here we go. A little bit glitchy. Let's see if it fixes itself. So it's about a series of different kinds of streets, some that are optimized for autonomous vehicles, like the one you saw a few seconds ago. This is sort of a walking and biking path. Oops, that's very glitchy. But creating a kind of street that you don't really think of as a street normally. Let's see if this will work. So beneath the woven city, there's another network of mobility for logistics, goods and waste, which have access to units. So in this case, bringing dinner up to a family. Also, you can imagine things like being able to store objects that you only use every month or every year somewhere further away. So reducing the amount of space that you need in your own apartment and having storage somewhere else. And then, also sort of integrating autonomous vehicles with the architecture of the city and allowing for kind of door-to-door, point-to-point connections. So a bit more of a futuristic take, but one that Toyota is actually very serious about. Akio Toyota presented this together with Bjarke at the big automotive conference in 2018. Some on-site preparation is happening right now, and we expect that we should be seeing some of this very soon. Oops. There's Akio unveiling it, and more to come. I spent the last, a good part of the last year living in Malaysia, working on this project, which was a competition that we won. I would say because of COVID, we were working on this competition in the depth of the lockdown, and so we had nothing better to do than sort of design this city. So we worked really hard on it, and eventually won. This is for the extension of an island called Penang, which is the sort of second largest city. It's a bit of a city-state. In Malaysia, here at what we call the crossroads of the world. So these are all the shipping lanes in the world, and Malaysia has this real sort of cultural diversity that comes from all of the different cultures that have met here for many centuries, as well as biological diversity being one of the 13 most biodiverse places on the planet. So our proposal we called Biodiverse City, it basically consists of a series of 3 islands, which will total about 500,000 residents. For reference, the island itself, you can kind of see it up there, is about 1 million residents in an area about the same size of Manhattan, in that third of it there. And so the sort of framework for the first island is something that we've been working on very diligently for the last year, together with the developer and all of the engineers. So you can see a bit of a difference between the competition proposal and what you can see here on the right as the first phase, or sort of the master plan framework that's been worked out quite well with everyone. So a few of the principles that I've talked about in some of the other projects you'll see reappearing here. The first is the notion of a continuous grid. This is a roughly 350 by 350 meter grid. It reflects the sort of the typical size of parcels that are developed in this part of the world. Parcels are getting larger in terms of how big a single developer will create a kind of estate. But a lot of cities like this are planned with many cul-de-sacs, many gates, a very suburban pattern. So I would say like our first big effort was to ensure that we have a continuous grid that allows for public access across the entire island along any of these axes. The grid is kind of distorting here because it's aligned to predominant wind in the center of the island to promote cooling. You can also see that that's aligned with the airport, because the planes also like to go either in a tailwind or a headwind, never a crosswind. And so aligning corridors that have a lot of water and a lot of vegetation to the wind helps keep the city cool, as the city will become hotter with climate change. In addition to that grid, we have what we call the strategic biking network. So underneath these orange lines are basically a series of blue-green corridors. You can see it here, which have integrated within them generous space on either bank for biking, as well as ferries, walking, and then a series of kind of parks and different plazas running along the length. We also, through the urban design guidelines, have been encouraging a lot of porosity, public-private open spaces to activate these canals. So that's the strategic sort of biking system, and within this area you can see it goes underneath the bridges. You can get from anywhere on the island to anywhere else on the island within 15 minutes without crossing a road. And so that's a key feature for getting our modal split up to 50% active and public transit. In addition, we have an on-street network of bikeways. So, this isn't just a pretty picture. This is a very, very labored-on cross-section of a city street where we really had to work out, first of all, where all the utilities are going to go, because we're not allowed to put utilities underneath roadways in Malaysia. So we had to understand what utility could go under what sort of surface area. We have a minimum 6 meters for fire access within this area. Dedicated bike lanes, shaded by 2.5 to 5 meter wide swales, bus rapid transit, which is actually working on tires. It looks like a train, but it's just on tires. And again, sort of encouraging through the urban design guidelines, zero lot line development where you get eyes on the street, so a feeling of security and safety that promotes walking and biking, which then goes back into the modal split, which goes into the carbon footprint of the project, etc. Of course, having a bike share is a really important thing, and co-locating bike share at important intermodal hubs like train stations. A ferry network that's both working inside the freshwater network of the island and also the saltwater ferry coming from existing Georgetown. A bus and also a rail network. And then, as I said, sort of creating these intermodal hubs between all of these networks so that you can, if you come into the island on the LRT train, you can get off at a station and go down directly to the bus rapid transit, which might take you to another stop where you might get off and get on a bike and take it on the superhighway. You can also go straight from the LRT station to the water taxi if you choose. So really trying to create these moments where you have very seamless connections between different forms of transit. Through this project, we were required to meet the Low Carbon Cities Framework for Malaysia, which as a baseline requires a 40% reduction of carbon footprint over a typical development of the same size. So through primarily our mobility network, we were able to reduce the carbon footprint of the project by 40%. If you've read Bill Gates' latest book, you'll know that 40% isn't going to cut it. So we have to get to net zero eventually. But it is a big step, particularly in a developing context like Malaysia. And then, of course, in addition to all of this sort of utilitarian planning, we're of course looking at how to create amazing places, a very green city, one with a lot of amenity along its banks, the banks of its waterways, where we're able to replant and nurture mangroves, which each mangrove tree sequesters about 6 times as much carbon as a typical tree, a typical land-based tree. And a city that has certain qualities that are driven by all of these sort of very, very rational planning steps we've taken. Another context we've been working in, which actually is both a combination of working within an existing city and working in a totally sort of tabula rasa context, is in Barranquilla in Colombia, which sits actually on the Caribbean coast. It's also called the Puerta de Oro, the sort of gateway to South America. It's a bit like New York City in the sense that it sits at the intersection of a major river with the ocean. And you'll note that it's sort of separated from the historic heart of Colombia, and that's both been its weakness through much of the 20th century, but I think it's also its strength now in that it has a certain sense of independence and innovation. So we were asked by the government and the governor of Atlántico to basically look at how the city might be growing in the future. The city itself is a place that has kind of been bustling in the early 20th century. A lot of immigration, including Middle Eastern immigrants. Shakira is from Barranquilla, and her name reflects that mixing. The city kind of turned very much inward and had a more domestic focus in the late 20th century. But today, it's globalizing and it's growing. And so the governor very rightly wanted to figure out what to do about that. If you look at the historic growth of the city spatially, you see that from 1821 to 1958, 1991, 1999, even 2011, the basic boundary of the city has not changed so much. There's been sort of an invisible wall that's been created by the lack of security in the countryside. But if you look in just the last 8 years, the growth of the city has started to explode, primarily along, coming back to urban mobility, along these arterial roads that are moving out from the center of the city. And the study that we did was commissioned on the occasion of the second ring road here in the dotted line being built. And the governor and the mayor of the city knew that this would mean that there would be a lot of development in that area between, and wanted to understand how to make a more balanced city. Even though the land looks like it's sort of virgin, it is all owned by someone, so very fragmented land ownership. And with ad hoc development of the type that's typical in this area, you would eventually have complete sprawl. So the question was, what can we do in advance that can allow the city to grow, but also create value and amenity within the city? So, as with a lot of the projects that I talked about previously, we started with the people who live here, sort of taking a scan of all the municipalities along the length from Puerto Colombia, past Barranquilla to Galapa, Malambo, Soledad. And the brief was really, how can we take this series of municipalities, which historically have been separate, but that are beginning to work as one, and create the first metropolitan plan for a city in Colombia? So we sort of did an exhaustive set of site visits and studies looking at a number of issues that are quite specific to Barranquilla. One that's very important is that it has the second largest carnival in the world after Rio. And it's a big part of the identity of the city. And our spatial framework sort of started with nature. So looking at areas that are recommended for preservation, that are critical habitats, either because they're riparian, meaning they are They are adjacent to water, or they're sort of important clusters of dry tropical forest. The one in the north helps buffer salt winds from salinating the soil. And we kind of formalized those areas into a sort of green band on the exterior of the city, and then a series of green hearts between the second ring road and the existing core of the city. And then we connected them with a series of biodiversity corridors, which, whenever you have patches and you connect them with corridors, you end up with sort of a supercharged habitat. Irrigation is also important here, given that it's a dry climate where there's going to be less and less water in the future. So we're diverting actually a small percentage of flow from the Rio Magdalena through a new canal, the Arroyo León, which is irrigating the central parks there. Connecting the new territories together with the old territories through a loop that kind of circumvents trying to get through the dense fabric and gets you from anywhere in the city to anywhere else in the city within 45 minutes, sort of going under and over conflicts to stay efficient. We called it El Hilo, the thread that links Barranquilla together. And then back to the kind of New York observation of making sure that radial grids or radial mobility patterns don't stay radial, but that we really try to make them into grids. Creating a grid where at the nodal points we then have a sort of average 10-minute or so walking distance from transit, which sort of leads to this pattern that we see here. And then also thinking about sort of leveraging some of the existing strengths of the municipalities along this length with sort of education and innovation in the north, making and production in the central areas, and then logistics and distribution in the south. And just kind of a sense of what that fabric might feel like. And the ecological areas also are not completely preserved. There can be farmland, there can be energy production, there can be very low density housing. But this is an effort that the city and the metropolitan area basically will undertake to ensure that connectivity of green between the exterior of the city and the interior. And here are some of the corridors that are created through that plan. So this is that sort of weave of green in one of the central parks of the city. The Arroyo León, which is both irrigating the new territories, creating value for adjacent real estate, and also serving as a stormwater reservoir, because Barranquilla has very intense rain events when it doesn't have drought. And then thinking about new transit-oriented development with El Hilo there, looping along the waterfront in sort of the post-industrial areas along the river's edge. So we kind of expressed this with the vision of a day in the life of Barranquillan, sort of starting off in more of a kind of mixed-use housing with a close relationship with the street line. Dropping her kids off at daycare by a bike station in a central plaza, having a safe, dedicated bike path taking her from her local neighborhood plaza to the larger kind of transit plaza, transferring to the Hilo, where she has like a 20-minute ride to her place of work, which is in one of the new territories in the north. So we completed that just before COVID, and since then we've been working with the mayor, the new mayor of Barranquilla, to kind of take those same principles and apply them to the existing city and do a sort of a more tactical and strategic plan for the growth of the city itself, the densification and improvement of parks and other things, working with the goals that they've already been pursuing, adding climate change as a major sort of issue. And really focusing on climate change here because, indeed, with current policies, there are a lot of indications that climate could go up by 2.7 degrees Celsius if nothing is done. The Paris Agreement has us at 1.5 to 2 degrees. And just for a sense of scale, if we hit 5 degrees, it's essentially the end of human civilization. So this is a key input as we continue our work there. And then I'm just going to finish off with one last project. which to end a talk on urban mobility, I think I need to hit. And that is a project looking at sort of one of the newest technologies of mobility that's being examined right now. In boating, there have been improvements over the years. In air, in rail, in cars, not quite as much. And so the Hyperloop, which is here all the way on the right, is a technology which I think in this presentation, a lot of the discussion has been about mobility within cities. But in terms of intercity mobility, Hyperloop does have the potential to reduce travel times quite a bit. Just for a little bit of a sense of what a sort of even more future-forward mobility experience might be, I'll let this roll. This is work we did with Virgin Hyperloop One. This is a great innovation. We figured out that if you placed a window every several feet, basically at each of these rings, you would get a continuous experience of feeling like there's a continuous window because of the speed at which you'd be moving. So this is really about sort of making those transition moments, those intermodal moments, much more seamless by actually packing one mode, the sort of private car, into another mode, the sort of collective pod, which then gets sent at high speeds via the tube. Cutting commutes that might have been hours into minutes. So, you could ask, okay, that's great, but, what does that matter for Central America or other parts of the equatorial globe? We have a project going on right now that we call Master Planet, which, as absurd as it sounds, is actually looking at a master plan for the planet to get to net zero. And so there have been a number of themes that we've been exploring through that, one of which is transportation. So I just want to end here with a little bit of a moonshot idea, which is that a lot of the GDP, the accelerated GDP growth and population growth is in sort of areas of let's say, the New World. When you look at the way that connections might be made across the globe for the most efficient path of a sort of global loop, you find something like this loop winding its way through unexpected places, through Central America, for example, and Guatemala, through parts of Africa. And so if you then also start thinking about this combined with a more sort of global energy distribution system, water sharing, all these kinds of things that we're going to need, it actually sort of turns the way that we think about geoeconomics and geopolitics a little bit on its head. So I just wanted to share this as a sort of a what if, and I think it's these kind of what ifs we should be thinking about as designers every day. So I'll close here with a quote that Bjarke loves and that we think about a lot in the office, which is that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And that's by William Gibson, the author, in 2003. And I think that cities are really where those innovations are going to happen. It's also where a lot of the biggest challenges are going to be faced. And so I'm sort of really excited to be a planner today, and that we sort of have something to contribute to society. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
Muchísimas gracias a Jeremy Siegel por su invaluable participación en esta Bienal de Arquitectura Guatemala 2021. Abrimos en este momento el espacio de preguntas y respuestas y tenemos ya una pregunta por parte de una persona que nos está viendo a través de Facebook, la cual voy a traducir para Jeremy para facilitar la comprensión. Jeremy, we have a question from our online audience for you. What role do you believe LEED and other green building standards will serve in the future? Do you believe that standards that exist today will be able to adapt as technology changes to fit the needs of the future?
I mean, I think regulations and policy are lagging behind actual need. It is only when we're forced to do these kinds of things that they will happen. And you see that in New York City, for example, where we've had a new local law passed that's basically now requiring that buildings that were once all glass and might have had, no PV panels or no green roof are now having to think about those things. So it changes the design parameters. So, I think basically regulations and code needs to change. It needs to keep up with the need to reduce our carbon footprint. And then, the other side of it is economics, and as that happens, as more of us are required to sort of use these kinds of technologies, with economies of scale, they'll get cheaper, and eventually, the hope is that they will become more cost-effective than some of the existing technologies. It really depends on what particular technology you're talking about, but I guess the main statement is that I think there's and I think everybody sort of agrees that there's a mismatch today between policy and need in terms of reducing carbon footprint and averting climate change.
Thank you so much. ¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta por parte de nuestra audiencia? Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Agradecemos a Jeremy una vez más.